So welcome everyone to the Biosecurity and Bees webinar on supporting pollination security in our regions. We've been very strategic, I'm going to say, in following on from World Bee Day yesterday. So hopefully everyone has been busy with that. Yeah, I managed to see a whole pile of things that came through my socials as well. So welcome everyone. Can I just acknowledge that we're all meeting, or not meeting, or joining from various parts of First Nations country across Australia. I welcome you to add where you're from in the chat or on your handle if you so wish to do that. I'm in Bibliman, Noongar Budja on the south coast of Western Australia myself. Some really bland and boring housekeeping stuff. Firstly, for those who I haven't met, my name's Justin Bolonge. I always forget to introduce myself. I'm the biosecurity lead for NRM Regions Australia and our Biosecurity Hub project. And we're also supported today by Saj and Trish. So thank you for joining us as well. And we have some great presenters, so I'll introduce those in a second. So I was going to go into some boring and bland housekeeping stuff. Just to confirm that the session today is being recorded. So we're doing that so we can provide it to other people that might want to use this. So just take that into account if you have any sensitivities with that in terms of questions you may ask. Please take that into account, but our presenters are okay with it. So just so everyone knows that. Please mute yourself like you have done when you're not talking. If you can indicate where you're from when you ask a question, and we'll have questions after each of the presentations, or if it's in the chat, please do that. That would be super. Use the chat for questions in the first instance, but we will have an open session for questions later on. So at the end of it, either preferably whack them in the chat, but if you prefer to verbalise them, that's fine as well. And look, I just wanted to finally acknowledge that we've got some excellent presenters today. So Bianca Giggins from the Australian Honeybee Industry Council, just wave, Amy. Bianca, so there you are. Amy-Marie Gilpin from the Hawkesbury Institute for the Environment, and Richard Keane from DAF is going to join us a little later. So thank you for joining us. We also have some attendees from Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, so welcome along as well. It's great to have some external attendees too from the NRM and people from across Australia from the NRM sector. So welcome all. I'm going to move on to our first presentation. So that's from Bianca. So Bianca's based in the New South Wales Hunter Valley and it's at the heart of the Varroa mite incursion. So she's really well placed to talk to us about biosecurity and bees. Bianca's been a really keen beekeeper for over 10 years and she's really passionate about agriculture and the environment and basically just the future of the beekeeping sector. So good on you, Bianca, for your passion in that area. Before what she's been doing currently, Bianca was working for the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries as a Varroa mite surveillance coordinator. So she's, as I said, really well placed to run us through some of those technical details and practical details of what Varroa mite and biosecurity means for bees. So Bianca, I'll hand over to you and we'll have some time for questions at the end of your presentation. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks very much for having me today. So look, yes, I work for the Australian Honeybee Industry Council. I'm currently the National Varroa Mite Coordinator, working within the New South Wales national response for the Varroa eradication and now the transition to management. I just wanted to start off with giving you some information around ARBIC's actual structure. If we could go to the next slide. So ARBIC is made up of 10 member bodies. So the member bodies actually represent beekeepers on the ground in our industry. And they also represent every step in the supply chain of the honeybee sector. So they all contribute to the networking directly with industry participants. Our board of directors operates within a structure that allows the CEO, Denny Lefebvre, and myself to work as an ARBIC team and represent industry outward to all of the other sections, including to the Department of Ag, Plant Health Australia, specifically port surveillance and bee biosecurity, and to be part of the response deed, which is how we've come to the place of being in the response for Varroa, and several others in the history of the honeybee industry. And we also have a direct line as an ARBIC team to the AgriFutures and Hort Innovations boards, where we receive lots of funding, and we assist them into understanding what the key priorities are for our industry in research and development. We have a direct arm on occasion, depending on the state of the nation, in terms of federal and state departments, to represent industry's needs and advocate for change if we feel the need. And then we've also got a really keen structure that's obviously growing at this stage, and you'll understand why when I finish through my presentation, with pollination-dependent industries across Australia. So we're part of the Plant Industry Forum, and we sit on several subcommittees that are representing the pollination-dependent industries. So we have an intrinsic link with them because of the nature of the honeybee industry and our connection to pollination. So if you want to go to the next slide. So a little bit about our industry. We are responsible for around 264 million GVP nationally. However, we also contribute around $14 billion towards the agriculture and horticultural industries and their production through pollination services. We do have an increasing demand for pollination and a decreasing domestic honey price, which has put us in a bit of a pinch point, given we're about to transition to managing Varroa. And then there's also an additional change to the industry that I'll outline in the next slide around the continual growth of recreational beekeeping and its impact on our honeybee industry itself. So if you have a look at the details in red, we just wanted to outline some industry stats to share an understanding of the size of our honeybee industry in Australia. And we focus on beekeepers in red. The number of recreational beekeepers has significantly increased in the last few years. And we think maybe this could be due to COVID, new hobbies that people take up, and beekeeping would be one of those. And then there also is an increased community interest and awareness of honeybees globally, and that is also a key driver in people taking up beekeeping as a hobby. The commercial sector, however, has had very limited growth, and if we look at the hive numbers in yellow, we notice that despite the number of commercial beekeepers remaining static, they've actually just increased the number of hives in which they manage. Now, the pressure on the industry, as mentioned before, is forcing beekeepers to need to have and manage more hives per enterprise. And our beekeepers are just operating in a tough environment currently, with low honey prices, with weather extremes, with diseases and pests that put pressure on them for managing. And of course, the uncertainty of the Varroa is adding to those challenges. Next slide. So some of our existing challenges in the industry exist around the key points here. Now, not all flowers are created equal. Having access to a range of floral resources is vitally important for reaching the nutritional needs of honeybee colonies. Quality resource access underpins healthy colonies and honey production in Australia. Currently, our honey production, about over 70% of the average 20-tonne national crop is produced from our native forests. So access to native forests is very important in the continuation of the national healthy colony population. The other important factor in terms of challenges for us is the importation of honey and the adulterated products. It's remained steady as an import to Australia over the last 10 years, but as domestic costs increase and the pressures remain with other areas, consumer choices do impact our industry's bottom line extensively, and a vast amount of our work is to portray to consumers to look at the label and purchase Australian honey. Another one is obviously, as part of this process today, is that biosecurity has a huge impact, both exotic threats and endemic pests and diseases. They're constantly felt by our industry. The costly impacts of hive losses and reduced efficiency in production and marketability in terms of live exports of honeybees to different parts of the world are all affected by biosecurity, and its impact is widely felt across a lot of the industry, regardless of their recreational or commercial aspect. The impacts on hive health can impact, just like other intensive livestock enterprise. So we also have the other pressures of the environmental and natural disasters. So drought, floods and fires have had a constant presence in the honeybee industry over the last few years. And now obviously the new challenge is Varroa. So I wanted to touch on what is Varroa. If we click to the next slide. So it's a nasty little beast. It's a parasitic mite that originally evolved on Asian honeybees, and it did host shift onto the European honeybee. A few years back, it feeds on honeybees at all life stages of the honeybee's life cycle. It vectors pathogens as well, including the largest worldwide risk to honeybee health, and that's deformed wing virus, which is not present in Australia at the moment, but they do have very negative effects on honeybees and collectively a colony. So they feed on fat body tissue, they spread viruses, they induce foraging at a younger age for bees. They then return with less pollen and nectar within their crops and their baskets. This then has a flow-on effect to smaller bees being born from the hive to work their life cycle, a reduction in their lifespan. And then it also impacts on the brain activity of honeybees, and it decreases their ability to return to the hive. So we lose a lot of bees day to day because of their impact from being fed on by Varroa at almost every stage of their life. If you want to go to the next slide. Honeybee colonies will eventually die from a Varroa infestation unless the mite population is continually reduced via some sort of intervention from a beekeeper. An individual mite doesn't kill one single bee, but it does suffer across the colony and eventually collapses. And it can have differing effects on colonies depending on the time of the year, the environment, and any existing pest and disease. So beekeepers will need to implement an intervention. And most of the time, these interventions cost money and time and effort. And so we move to the next slide and we talk about how these things would impact Australian industry. So we are the last major honey producing country in the world to be infested with Varroa. The global experience is likely to repeat here in Australia in the same similar conditions. We will lose between 20 and 30% of our commercially registered industry beekeepers, which also has a flow-on effect to the number of hives that we have in our country available to do pollination services and to produce honey. We'll have a 30% increase to the cost of production because we will have to spend time to intervene to colonies to save them from dying from Varroa. And that can be in the form of different types of integrated pest management techniques, including the costs of implementing chemical treatments to the colonies to be able to reduce Varroa numbers. And importantly, and a part of this particular presentation today is to really outline that 90 to 95% of feral colonies that exist in Australia's landscape will actually die, and they won't return unless they come from a managed colony that may swarm in the future. So over the next few years, we're going to experience a loss of feral colonies across our landscape, and this is going to have a really big impact on the dependency of crops that look for honeybee pollination for yields, etc., in different areas. So, and then the other top of the chain, I guess, in the impact that it will have on the industry is if we look at the experiences globally, the New Zealand experience is that they have annual colony losses of up to 20% of their colonies over the winter time that don't make it through to the next season. And in the US, they have an increased colony loss to around 50% of the colonies that they have in their country, which is a really big problem, and it takes a while to recover from that. But these are annual losses, so there is a constant requirement to build numbers and to maintain the national colony number to then underpin pollination security. The next slide gives us some information around the gradual increase and trend upwards of colony losses in the American industry, who've been living with Varroa for nearly 25, 30 years, and they have really suffered immensely, and a lot of that has been to do with the nature of the industry over there in terms of the change from honey production to relying on pollination events and services. So they also have had a really awful chemical bandwagon of treatments and ineffective treatments due to changes and lack of ability in the management systems that they've put in place. And we're learning from them as we move along in Australia with learning to live with Varroa. But this is a key point that I make, in that if we don't do our management well, we could follow suit in some of the same footsteps as our fellow beekeepers overseas. And the next slide will actually provide us with some detail around our closest neighbours, the New Zealand industry, who have less of an impact annually. However, they've been living with Varroa for nearly 15 years. They've had a really good education program that started in New Zealand at the time they decided to transition to management. That has underpinned a lot of really good education, great management techniques, and good practice that has underpinned their success at managing Varroa. They've also had a bit of a bubble in their Manuka honey production around the same time that Varroa really started to establish in New Zealand, and therefore the price of honey that they were receiving was far outweighing the cost that it takes to manage colonies. Their overall winter losses are sitting at around 12%. With variations among the seasons, but this year in their loss project that manages the details and the data around their colony loss in New Zealand, they've started to take information around autumn losses, which is an important factor to consider, that they lose 16.8% in autumn, and then after winter they lose a further 12.7%. So this is a huge amount of colonies that come out of the system that need to be rebuilt, and they take time to rebuild. So it is a cumulative effect on their industry, and it also has an impact on the ability for the industry to support pollination dependency as well. If you want to go to the next slide, some of the things I wanted to share around the on the ground changes to our industry as a honeybee sector in terms of managing and considering the costs involved is that the beekeepers on the ground that have a livelihood or even a hobby in beekeeping are now acutely needing to assess their time management, their planning of how they're going to attack the levels of Varroa in their colonies when they know they've got Varroa, and implementing a knowledge-based integrated pest management strategies to keep their bees going. A lot of beekeepers will actually need to improve their skill sets for understanding how to manage Varroa and understand how their colonies are now changing over time with the Varroa infestation. We also need them to understand more about the colony phase and improvements to their management techniques, overall pest and diseases that cover a lot of the biosecurity risks we already have, and then Varroa on top of that. And I guess one of the points I like to make too is that the environmental conditions that we already have that persist annually, sometimes biannually, sometimes every few years, we might have devastating floods in different areas or a long-term drought in certain spaces of the country. They will always be there and they will pop up in the future. And now we have Varroa on top of those environmental considerations. So it's been a difficult time for beekeepers to pick up all this new information, but also still continue to battle on with all of the existing challenges that face them. And we did talk about the costs. The costs are not just in purchasing of chemicals, but the costs also there for the management, time and labour. And that has been a huge consideration in terms of what beekeepers think about when they're planning and implementing a strategy to manage Varroa when they know they've got it. And the other thing is the consideration for the imminent pollination-dependent industries. So we'll be looking a little bit later on about some new roles coming into the industry that will help support and be the conduit into both the honeybee industry and pollination dependent industries. But we do need to now consider a little bit more detail around the insurance of honeybee safety on farm, and we'll be going into that soon. I just wanted to show a couple of food crops that are dependent on honeybees. I've grouped them together because the table was quite large before I did this. I couldn't fit it all onto the one page. But I wanted to have a think about that 1/3 in the mouthfuls we eat comes from honeybee pollination. And it's not necessarily the food we eat, that is fruit and vegetables. It can also be fodder crops. So honeybees have long been recognised as the most efficient and effective pollinator for agricultural crops compared with other insects. Honeybees form colonies of large populations and with foraging field bees. Individuals have hairy legs and coats ready to attract and move pollen from one flower to the next. And it's important to realise that the rest of the world manages honeybees and produces food with Varroa, but there are additional challenges involved, and the annual crop losses or colony losses impacts that. So many of the major food crops rely solely on honeybees for pollination. Until Varroa populations will stabilise in Australia and honeybee industry gets on top of their management practices to sustain their colonies, reductions in our national managed hive numbers is expected, and this will have an impact. So along with the loss of feral hives, pollination dependency will become realised as the mite spreads and as the growth in agriculture and horticulture increases. So too will the need for commercial pollination services that support some of the most pollination dependent crops. The dependency scale in this table really outlines the key that honeybees provide in essential pollination for food security. Next slide. So just a little snippet of some experiences that I had. Many growers at the moment rely on some scale to feral bees to provide their free pollination services. And feral colonies are often the greatest risk from Varroa, as there's no management to mitigate the loss. So the degree to which Australian industries will rely on free pollination is not well understood, but it's difficult to say for certain that what the impact of losing our feral populations will be. But here's 2 raspberries. Now, I took them from the same tunnel on the same day back in February 2023, a visit to the Narna Glen region of New South Wales, which at the time was a red eradication zone under the emergency response for Varroa. No honeybees were able to go into the polytunnels or on this farm during the flowering in the previous October 2022. From inside the tunnel on the left, you can see that the fruit didn't set, the pollination hadn't been achieved, and that fruit can't even be removed correctly from the set. It will crumble in your hand if you try to remove it and put it in a punnet. Once it was to go the right colour and be ready to pick, it wouldn't actually be able to be picked. And then this outer edge on the right-hand side of the tunnel, it actually maybe had some feral honeybees visit the site from the area around the farm. At the time, we weren't 100% certain that all of the feral bees had been removed. However, this particular one on the right that I've got a photo of does have a better fruit set, and it does have the opportunity there to potentially grow into a better sized fruit that would be worth a crop for that farmer. But the majority, I'm talking maybe 95% of the fruit that they were looking to gather that season in that February timeframe was not reliable, was not a crop at all. So they did introduce some fly species during the flowering period in October because there were no bees or honeybees that were able to be put on those sites. It didn't have a very positive impact on the quality and the quantity of the yield from this farm, unfortunately. So across the globe where production horticulture is required, there's really no alternative pollinator that provides the pollination services at the same scale as the honeybees. Next slide. Just a little bit about, we've gone one, that's the right one, sorry. In large crops, there may be multiple beekeepers engaged to achieve the required hive density for pollination. This introduces the biosecurity risk in itself due to robbing and the drifting of honeybees between hives. And it will become more risky with Varroa becoming endemic. And there's lots of it's stress upon the industry on pollination services in the next few years, as Varroa hasn't completely spread across all of Australia, rather than it is contained at the moment in the New South Wales state. But all pollinating species rely on the presence of floral resources like pollen and nectar. So most crop pollinating insects, including honeybees, are just generalist feeders that have a broad diet and require the presence of a variety of pollen and nectar sources. So if growers take steps to maximise bee health and other pollinator health on their properties, the colonies that are pollinating their crops will perform better and be better placed to withstand Varroa, to withstand the other biosecurity threats that exist for those particular pollinators. It will make beekeeping more expensive and less profitable to live with Varroa. It could, in fact, then drive the price of pollination contracts upwards if the nature of the farm space that honeybees are taken to is not one that is productive for beekeepers. The next slide. So a little bit about the opportunity for a sustainable future, and it isn't all doom and gloom. There's no doubt beekeeping will be more difficult, but hive health, and even in managed colonies, by well-skilled beekeepers, will be significantly difficult to maintain. Improving colony health improves pollination efficacy, and it better supports hives living with Varroa. So to enhance the health and diversity of pollinators and ensure pollination services remain reliable and resistant and resilient now and in the future, the floral support should be available year-round for honeybee colonies and also in the close proximity to crops. So the hive health before, during and after a pollination event all contribute to a sustainable food production system. So access to those floral resources when beekeepers are not performing a pollination service underpin the health of the colonies when they do turn up for a pollination contract. So we need to think about providing sites for honeybees that are sheltered on the site of a farm with clean water. And a big factor now for some beekeepers is to make sure that the site is profitable for them, that when they leave, their hives are healthy and they're not impacted by some of the practices that occur on farm. So it's important that farmers and growers begin to understand the needs of honeybee colonies during the time they're on site, and then considering using some integrated pest management techniques to actually manage the health of honeybees while they're on farm, considering additional floral resources like underplantings and supporting the honeybee nutrition that way. Some crops are not particularly important or good for honeybees when they're in a pollination service, so underpinning them with better floral resources is also useful. And it's shown that it doesn't impact necessarily on the quality of pollination, rather that it improves it in some instances. Next slide. Some of the most important tools that beekeepers and growers can use in the future to ensure a long-term, hassle-free and mutually beneficial business relationship is communication. A national pollination coordinator will soon be recruited by the National Transition to Management Program for Varroa. So this role will strategically support and partnership between beekeepers and pollination-reliant industries for the 12-month term of the program. The aim of it is to incentivise growers to take steps to maximise bee health and minimise impacts, including things like integrated pest management and reducing pesticide exposure. Some farms may have never engaged with beekeepers, and until Varroa starts to spread and become an endemic pest across the country, some growers may have never investigated the additional implications of their practice on farm and how that might impact colony health. So we're looking at improvements to all stages of production, including bringing beekeepers on farm and having those communication channels really well established so that we can have a successful and sustainable future. Next slide. Raising awareness and increasing ARBIC's advocacy for industry well into the future is the best way to assure us a sustainable industry in the years to come. So we're progressing through an education and extension program that's underway in the Transition to Management program. I'll be managing for the next 12 to 18 months the Varroa development offices across the country, which are designed to take on beekeepers in the field and to give them hands-on experience and support in their beekeeping practice. We're aligning and updating our Australian Beekeeping Industry Code of Practice as well, which will accommodate Varroa challenges and the best practice guides to be able to live with Varroa for honeybee industry. And we know that in a biosecurity situation that codes of practice are actually a really good place and a foundation for best management across industry, but also an understanding then of and the awareness of honeybee health for those pollination dependent industries that need us and work together in that. There'll also be, and has already begun, some Varroa management education workshops across the country that support industry in teaching them about managing Varroa and some of the impacts that they are expected and some planning that they might like to begin to do to consider what they're going to do with their decision making once they do have Varroa in their colonies. And on the horizon, we've completed some AgriFutures forums supporting the advancement of a national Varroa strategy for research and development, and also a queen bee sector analysis. This presentation doesn't have a lot of time to go into the queen bee sector, but there is some really important work that needs to be commenced to start a national bee breeding strategy to actually support some opportunity for Varroa resistant honeybee genetics to strengthen our industry even further. So we continue to address national priorities for the industry with collaboration and listening to contribute and improve the productivity to promote and protect the honeybee industry's interest. We continue to be involved in the shared responsibility of managing biosecurity on the ground through research and capacity building, growing awareness and information with thoughtful leadership and coordination for proactive industry. And part of that, as I said earlier, is pushing for Australian consumers to support 100% Australian honey at the shops, check the labels and do those things so that you can be part of the solution to safeguard Australia's pollination future.
Great. Thanks, Bianca. That was very detailed and really informative. So thank you very much for that. I think, look, in the interest of time, are you able to stick with us till the discussion session? Excellent.
Yeah, definitely.
We might just carry questions forward until then. I'm not seeing anything in the chat immediately, so we might just move on to our next presentation. And so Dr. Amy-Marie Gilpin is presenting now on supporting and conserving pollinators for sustainable crop production. So Amy is a school-based researcher and lecturer with the Hawkesbury Institute for the Environment at Western Sydney University. So really key about this, she's a pollination ecologist whose research to date has largely focused on identifying the pollinators in our ag landscapes and crops, both in temperate and tropical areas. So that's great. Thanks for your time, Anne-Marie, and I'll hand over to you to start your presentation.
No worries. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for attending. And I think this talk will actually complement exactly what Bianca's been talking about quite well. So yeah, I'm a plant pollinator ecologist, so I'm really interested in understanding the relationships between our pollinators and our plants, and that's obviously in a variety of different systems. But today I'll be mainly focusing in on those agricultural areas. So I guess the reason why I'm always concentrating on this kind of area of ecology is really with a conservation lens. So what I really want to be trying to do is to conserve pollinators that we have within these agricultural landscapes, or support them in terms of the floral resources that are available within those areas to try and secure pollination of our food crops. So I guess something that's always kind of lost is the fact that pollination is an inadvertent process. You know, these bees aren't going out there to purposefully do this process or fulfill the need for pollination. It's a mutualistic relationship, and the insects themselves are getting, rewards in terms of food. So nectar and pollen, and both are really crucial for health of the organism. And in return, that plant is hopefully getting fruit set or seed set as a result. Here are some pictures of some typical Australian agricultural scenes that I'm sure you guys are all aware of. In the top left hand, we've got an almond orchard. And then at the bottom these are two cherry orchards that I work within out at Young in New South Wales. But I guess I'm hoping what you guys are seeing straight away is that within almond orchards in particular, there's a real management practice of removing all co-flowering plants that are on that bottom layer between hedgerows, between the crops themselves and in between the trees themselves. Whilst in cherry orchards, what we see is there is a retainment of the co-flowering species. Sometimes these properties will have remnant eucalypt forests that are adjacent to the crop area. And this can be really important in terms of helping to facilitate native pollinators that are within those areas. Obviously, these are highly disturbed areas in terms of this used to be once forest, and now we're trying to grow crops. So in terms of both managed honeybee health and native pollinator health, we really need to be aware that these are highly modified systems and that potentially we need to be adding additional resources into those areas to help facilitate their existence within them. So in Australia, the vast majority of our crop pollination is carried out by European honeybees. They are the dominant managed pollinator for obvious reason, ease of bringing them into these systems. Their floral constancy is very good, so the way in which they pollinate is very effective. But there are native pollinators that also provide these crucial resources as well in terms of pollination. So crops like mangoes, the vast majority of pollinators on mango crops, especially in the territory, are actually native pollinators. And they're usually in the terms of flies, but also stingless bees. even on our work out at Young, there was quite a few native bees that are also visiting the crops. Within our systems though, and especially now that we have Varroa mite, we have been over-reliant to some extent on honeybees and probably taking them for granted to much degree. Bianca touched on the fact that a lot of our pollination is actually carried out by feral honeybees, which is absolutely correct. So potentially into the future, we're going to see a decline on properties that aren't, using or bringing in managed hives and that were reliant on feral honeybees. So we're going to have to see some sort of change there. Either they're going to have to pay then for pollination services to be brought on in terms of honeybees, or we're going to have to try and foster relationships to support native pollinators within these systems. Yeah, and so Bianca was exactly right. We will see a huge decline in our feral hives. So realistically, we're probably looking, if we look at the rest of the world, in a 90 to 95% decrease in feral hives. So this will be a massive problem in terms of trying to secure pollination for our pollinator-dependent crops. Some of the native pollinators that we do have within these systems are native bees. We also have a range of different beetles for certain crops, and some of them can even be pollinated by flies. And I guess I just want to stress that there is more to our pollination systems than just bees. It obviously depends on the crop itself. But realistically, if we are encouraging other pollinators, if they can do an effective job, we'll build up some sort of resilience, and we'll have move away from that over-reliance on one particular pollinator, which is really crucial as well. So when we're trying to think about our native pollinators, obviously we need to think about, well, what was the ecosystem like before we put in an agricultural landscape? So, we used to have diverse eucalypt-dominant woodlands with understory, lots of structure, lots of floral resources. Those floral resources would be available year-round. But it's not just in terms of floral resources either. We would have had a range of nesting habitat as well. And both these things are really crucial when we're trying to support and encourage native pollinators within these systems. If we have broad-scale clearing, obviously this limits severely the opportunities for outside floral resources, but also those nesting opportunities as well. So when we're thinking about agricultural landscapes, these are often highly simplified compared to the native forests that would have been there. Typically, there's very little in terms of floral resources that flower outside of the crop period. And really, these are crucial for wild insects and bees, and even managed bees. So it's really a boom and bust kind of landscape in terms of the floral resources. You'll have a very dramatic impact mass flowering crop, which might last anywhere from 1 week through to a couple of months. But outside that window, typically what we've seen is removal of any co-flowering species, whether that be when it coincides with the crop or outside or before that period as well. We also need to consider the types of management practices that are occurring on the property itself as well. A lot of our ground nesting bees in particular live in soil. So, things like ploughing, residual chemicals, grazing, this can all disturb insect habitat. So perhaps, you might be seeing flow-on effects then to your pollination services of your crop if you're looking at native bee pollination in those systems. So this kind of brings me to, well, what should our orchards really look like then? And how should we be thinking about supporting and conserving native pollinators? And I guess the one thing that I want to stress here is, indeed, a lot of crops aren't necessarily visited by native pollinators. There are some that are heavily dependent on native pollinators. But if we are supporting and conserving natives within these systems, we're actually not just potentially improving crop yield within our agricultural sector, but what we are doing is also helping the native plants that are on the periphery of these ecosystems as well. So we're able to then support and conserve pollinators, to link habitat, might be native habitat that's on the boundary fences or along roadsides, but this will help them to be able to reproduce as well. So there's kind of like a twofold flow-on effect here. Some of the research that we've been conducting, especially in apples and in cherries orchards, has really looked at this idea of co-flowering plants and how they can support pollinators. So you might remember when I showed the almond orchard and the removal of all those co-flowering plants and the understory there. That was a typical management practice that was kind of put forward to growers. But really, when we went to some of these apple and cherry orchards, we were seeing that there are co-flowering plants. So what we wanted to do was understand whether or not they're supporting pollinators and helping facilitate pollination of crops, or if we're potentially getting competition. So here is just a schematic of what could occur. We could have this nice flowering understory between the apple trees. There might be lots of floral diversity here. But we could get a scenario whereby we're actually getting all of our native pollinators visit co-flowering species at the bottom of the tree. And this can impact the number of visits and the pollination of our crop. So this is what we would see as a competition for floral visitors or for pollinators. On the flip side of that, what we could see is facilitation for visits, whereby because we've got co-flowering plant species, we've got a greater diversity of pollinators visiting our crop. We've got more abundance of our pollinators visiting the crop, and this can lead to more frequent visits and a higher yield of that crop. And indeed, this is exactly the kind of scenario we saw a facilitative effect of having co-flowering species within apples and cherry orchards. It was actually beneficial for growers to retain those co-flowering plants within these ecosystems. So to support pollinators, and this is another apple orchard out at Gilpin in New South Wales, having food year-round is super important. So this was taken in winter, but you can see we've got some brassica that's flowering in the foreground here, and that's a great floral resource for pollinators, both managed honeybees, but also feral bees and native bees as well. So we really need to be thinking about how we can provide floral resources year-round, especially during activity periods for the pollinators. And this will help with bee health. Not all plants obviously created equal, so we really need to think about what types of plants we're planting out, especially if there's potential for them to invade the native ecosystems that are around. And if we're trying to support native pollinators, really we need to be thinking about native genetically provenant plant species that can then be put out in these systems. And we also need to be thinking about the types of resources. So obviously we need pollen and nectar, but we need to be thinking about other things like resin. A lot of resin is used in the construction of hives. So we need to be thinking about plants and resources that the bees can gather for resin. I'll just quickly touch on this because this is some of the research that we did up in Katherine area and in Darwin. And here we were looking at pollination of mangoes and how we can really support and facilitate pollination within those systems. So mango orchards are really large and typically there's not much ground cover underneath, but along the edges of the property, there's usually fantastic bushland. Like I said previously, one of the major pollinators of mangoes are actually flies, and they're usually these carrion breeding flies. At a certain time in their life cycle, they need nectar to feed their young. And so that's the opportunity at which we're seeing them become effective pollinators of mango flowers. So what we did was we actually created what we were calling stink stations. Okay, so, you know, flies, obviously, in this case, they didn't need extra floral resources. What they actually needed to boost their populations was carrion. So we got a whole heap of carcasses and we had these barrels and we were putting them out into these orchards to try and facilitate and breed up those colonies of flies to help pollination within those systems. And it worked very effectively, I can tell you. Carrying out the study and watching the maggots was a bit tricky, but well worth it in the end. So yeah, we just need to be thinking about what types of pollinators we can facilitate and how we'd go about breeding up those populations. Another major pollinator within these systems is actually the syrphids, so hoverflies. And one of the key things that they need for their breeding cycle is water availability. So potentially popping out places where they can breed within these water troughs is going to help boost pollination within those systems. So pollinators obviously need more than just food, and we've touched on a bit of that. A lot of our native bees are actually ground nesting bees, and so they need access to soil. So things like mulching, ploughing, grazing by hooved animals obviously can impact the ground and therefore their availability of habitat for these guys. We also need to think about the other types of bees, so the other 30%, which really require, you know, pithy stems and small holes in wood and hollows and those kind of things. So when we're thinking about large-scale cropping systems, retaining some bushland that has some of these key attributes is really important to try and help support and conserve these types of pollinators. This was an aerial photograph from some of the orchards that I work in Bilpin. And you can see that the Bilpin area, for anyone that's unfamiliar, it's actually surrounded by Blue Mountains National Park and Wallamai National Park. So it's a very unique system, but it has fantastic bushland either side of most of the properties that we actually work on. So in order to, you know, these systems are heavily dependent on honeybees, but they're also visited very frequently by stingless bees, and they actually enact a lot of the pollination that occurs in these apple crops. And I guess this really just proves that maintaining that bushland, especially when it comes to native pollinators, because they actually don't travel very far. They only travel about 400 to 500 meters at best. But having that bushland that's close up towards the crop can really be beneficial, because you can get those flow-on effects from pollinators that are in the bushland coming out and then onto your property. Retaining this habitat is obviously really important, well, potentially just not only for the pollination of the crop, but also in terms of linking habitat for wild pollinators throughout the landscape. So, you know, there's that twofold effect that I was talking about before in terms of benefits for the crops, but also benefits for native bushland pollination as well. One aspect of our research, and this is something that comes up quite frequently, is about habitat augmentation and whether or not bee hotels can be effective in helping boost pollination within farm settings. And so we went out and we tried this. We used pithy stems, so bamboo kind of bee hotels, and also hardwood blocks. And we also had a ground nesting bee habitat augmentation as well. We did find that we did get into uptake of bees into these hotels. So yes, they are potential habitat for bees, but at the scale that we need pollination, this really isn't a very effective way of supporting pollinators on a farm. It's far better that you could support them by retaining some of that native bushland and potentially linking those habitats so that you get a flow-on effect of pollinators moving throughout the landscape, rather than you know, providing unnatural resources like this. Okay, so supporting conserving is obviously crucial. We really need to think about how pollination occurs within Australia, especially in terms of supporting pollinators that are within the landscape, in terms of the floral resources that are available. And now it's even more important, especially with Varroa sweeping through the nation. We need to create agricultural areas that plan for the needs of the pollinators themselves. We need to be thinking about in terms of foraging distances, food resources, and habitat, and how that's occurring year-round. All right, and that's basically it for me.
Great, thanks, Amy-Marie, and once again, a really insightful and detailed presentation. So we have a question, but we might again carry that forward through to the discussion, and we'll move on to our next presentation. But we've had a couple of really great contextual sort of informations about the importance of pollinators and where they sit in the landscape, how they impact on environmental and agricultural assets, and their role as sort of keystone species. we're going to move on now to a presentation from Rich Keane from DAF on some work they're doing on monitoring and some really interesting tech on the monitoring of and diagnostics of Varroa mite and for bees and beehives, which is a slightly different perspective, but still really, really important. So Richard's got over 20 years of leadership experience in the public sector and in international and national development. He commenced his current principal director role with DAF in 2020, and he's leading teams around Australia on biosecurity innovation, research and education programs. So it's really follows on a bit of a trend in terms of comms and education we've been talking about already. Currently, he's also the co-design lead for the Catalysing Australia's Biosecurity Initiative, working with stakeholders across the biosecurity continuum on our innovation and transformation needs in the biosecurity space. So, Rich, I'll hand over to you and allow you to progress with your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Is someone able to put, oh, there we go. Perfect, beat me to it with the PowerPoint. All right. Thank you very much for that introduction, and noting the time, I'm going to try and go through this reasonably quickly and leave time at the end for questions, but that was a really good presentation before. Look, just following on from that point around Catalysing Australia's Biosecurity Initiative, it's a co-design approach with DAF, SAR and a number of other partners across the, I'll call it the biosecurity ecosystem. We recently launched it at the ABARES Outlook conference, but it's a key element of bringing the partners together early in the piece to try and work on a lot of the wicked problems that we have in biosecurity. And there's a lot there in terms of the threats that we face pre-border, but the one that we're going to be talking about today is unfortunately the Varroa mite in Australia. And while that is unfortunate in the eradication program and treatment that we're going through, it's presented some unique opportunities. Before I do though, this is just a little bit about one of the sections that I've got there in my branch. Very lucky to have some really good operators there who are happy to work in that sort of nebulous space that can be innovation and research. So we've got risk research. We have partnerships, for example. People would know Uni of Melbourne. They've got the current grant for biosecurity research that we administer. It's called SEBRA. We also have, it was the innovation program, but that's currently been paused while we are reviewing the effectiveness of that 5-year program. And almost the BIP 2.0 is Catalysing Australia's Biosecurity Initiative, which I just talked about, and I'll talk a bit more as we go through. But again, opportunities to bring partners together, try and identify problems, and understand how they align with our strategic priorities. And on the federal side, you would have heard the National Biosecurity Strategy, the 6 core priorities, but there are a number of other sectorial and jurisdictional based ones that we also have. And then the innovation pilots, so Jess May and Mel Hindle are a couple of the people that we have in the team. There's a number of others, but help us look at some of these problems that are right here, right now. How can we address and work through with our partners to try and test new technology to make sure or see whether it's fit for purpose. So next slide. There we go. We've already set the scene in terms of the Varroa mite. Everyone would be aware of obviously the importance of it. And until recently, we remained free of Varroa mite thanks to our stringent security measures. But as everyone is aware, in June 2022, the mite was detected at the Port of Newcastle, and it's continued to spread around New South Wales despite the measures that have been taken. From June 2022, industry and government have worked closely in partnership in an attempt to eradicate the Varroa mite. With a recent increase in detections over the greater area, it's now made eradication a real challenge, and so we're looking into that sort of management phase, that dual phase as well. And this is more from the East Coast. Appreciate on the West, it's something that hasn't arrived there yet. We hope it doesn't, but what we're talking through today with these pilots might present some unique opportunities for people to consider. Next slide. And, you know, why DAF? Why did we do this? Did we need to? Well, we're involved in the original work around the eradication of Varroa mite, working with the partners and agencies. And during that initial time, we were looking at, it's called Purple Hive. You can see there it is a purple hive, but it's a really neat piece of AI and ML, artificial intelligence and machine learning technology. I will say, though, very costly in terms of the initial Purple Hive sort of set up and tests. But what it was, you know, could we do things differently? For example, we currently use sugar shakes. We use alcohol washers to test and check for Varroa mite. Are there other ways using new technology that's available, regardless of where you are, whether you're in metropolitan or remote and rural areas? When the National Management Group decided to move from an eradication program to more of that management control approach, we worked with, it's Fermanatech is the provider, basically to pilot the trial. And it was really something that it did work, was reasonably expensive, and we looked at different alternatives to how we could perhaps revise that down. And if anyone does know that AI and ML, basically it was using like optical character recognition and very sort of high level sensors to try and detect the Varroa mite on the bees as they're going in and out of the hive and around it, which, as you can imagine, is probably not something that, if you're ramping that up out, is very expensive. But we did have this pitch and explored a number of different options under that original Purple Hive banner. It came in through the Catalysing Australia's Biosecurity Initiative. We have a number of working groups that are targeted in, it can be in diagnostics, it can be in general surveillance, One Health, for example, that can be used to either start up or address and work with partners very early in the piece. So this is where Purple Hive came through. And what we decided, if we can just go on to the next slide, using the BeeRight, but in a revised format, and doing it in two distinct, I guess, phases, and one in the ACT as well as in New South Wales. And, you know, we've talked a bit about artificial intelligence and machine learning, but what is it? What can it do? So basically, you can see in the top right there on the photo, basically the little sensor there just sits on the top there. Hopefully that's clear enough. I probably should have sent it through in advance. And basically detects a whole lot of things that determine the health of the hive. And I will say that we looked at a number of tests, not just here in Australia. There's previous tests that have been done in New Zealand, which does have Varroa mite. Basically picks up on sound patterns, amongst other things, to determine hive health, whether it has Varroa mite or perhaps there might not be, there might be other issues there around the queen and the workers. So it can pick up distinct patterns. Basically, it's like an Internet of Things, so that information can be sent back through to we go through Telstra, but you can go through any provider if you really wanted to be able to get an indication of what particular health state the hive is at. So you can put these in each of your hives and have it all marked and referenced back. So hive 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it can present real-time information. And with this, you know, if it proves successful, which we think it will, you can consider a whole range of different things. You don't need to manually go out there all the time, or you might want to dedicate certain time to certain hives that may not be as healthy compared to others. And it's providing, probably for the first time, that evidence-based, data-driven type of approach. And it's something really that through the CAB that we're really keen on. And I can say evidence-based, data-driven, but it's got to be cost-effective as well. It can't be something that you go, yeah, we need this, but you're going to pay an arm and a leg to do it, and it's going to take a long time to show that effect. But really, that's what it is. And as I said, we have done previous tests in New Zealand. They were successful, did detect Varroa mite. We did do it with environmental DNA, which I'll come up to in a minute. But it's a really practical and neat way of being able to try and use real-time data and information instead of, again, sugar shakes or alcohol washers. Down the bottom right there, you should be able to see the little slide, but that's basically how the data can be presented to beekeepers and to get an actionable sort of view of what your hive or hive's health is like. and can give you other things around general hive activity, colony strength, and queen presence and things like that. So really, really good piece of tech. Next slide, please. There we go. Beat me to it. There's the dashboard. You know, it can give you that view of hive health. I think this one shows over 1,800 hives, so it's condensed and taken all that information, but you can pull it apart, tweak it, use it however you like. Again, it's a prototype or a beta version. There'll be amendments and adjustments that can be made as part of this pilot. It'll be working with our commercial and other beekeepers, backyard beekeepers and hobbyists to see if this is something that works for them. So apologies, I will send this afterwards in case anyone is interested to have a bit of a look. It's a bit hard on the screen there, isn't it? Next slide. So who else is involved? This is a CAB initiative. You hear me say CAB, but it is something that is, it's already been stood up. It's co-funded. We have at the moment 5 or 6 working groups, but things can be stood up if there's general interest. For example, if there was interest in Varroa in general under the National Management Group response, or I don't know, over on the WA side, doesn't have to be about bees. It could be the polyphagous shot-hole wood borer or something else that might be, you know, more current in terms of what you're dealing with. But you can leverage off the CAB for bringing partners, bringing in the expertise, bringing in research and development corporations. You know, Horde Innovation, a number of others are involved in this. So by doing that, you're getting people involved early in the piece, understanding what the business problem is, and trying to work together in that collective forum to trial things. And while I'm presenting today on a piece of tech on BeeRight and also the eDNA, there is a whole range of other things as well that we probably all get in our working environment and day, and trying to channel and put those good ideas through, and then be able to filter them and align them to our strategic priorities and also their effectiveness and whether they're ready. So, you know, the goal of this, while it's gone very well in terms of the pilot so far, there will be other steps and phases that we'll need to go through. But if we don't bring everyone together, what's the point when it comes time to, if we're considering implementation? If everyone hasn't been through that journey, they're going to say, go away. So really, that's what it is, you know, addressing some of those wicked problems in the biosecurity ecosystem, looking at innovative technology, digital systems, and hopefully transforming performance. Ideally, we would not like these sort of pests and disease in Australia, but if they do come through, we also need to be flexible and agile enough to be able to pivot and work together. And so this one, it's a collaboration with ACT Government, Queensland, New South Wales, Uni of Canberra, who help us on the eDNA side, as well as a whole lot of other people that I probably should have had up there to mention, including Vermanatech. So that's basically what the pilot is. If we just go to the next slide, I'll run through a bit more detail, because I'm sure people will probably say, okay, you talked a bit about it. What is it? What are the phases and things that we're doing? So short, sharp tests. Ideally, it might not work. Fail fast. It'll mean that either the government or governments haven't spent a lot of money investing in technology that is either not ready or not able to get there. But the idea is that it can be tailored for your commercial beekeepers, but also your hobbyists. So your citizen science type of approach, if you wanted to take that, use your cost effective channels to be able to get this information and be able to make informed decisions. Now, obviously, it's got to be validated and verified, which is some of the next phases. But if we don't go out and do these tests and get people on board, then there'll be no point. We are going out, or we have been out to areas in Australia where there is Varroa. As I said previously, we have tested in New Zealand, but we have been out to Kempsey, for example. But we're also validating those data sets and information so that your AI and your ML models get tightened up and it makes it a bit more effective, but also you're validating and happy with the results that you're getting with your environmental DNA, which I'll talk about in a second. Next slide. There we go, a bit about eDNA. I'm sure everyone already knows a lot about it. We used this sort of technology during that thing called COVID. We were doing COVID tests and swabs and things like that. similar technology, but it can be tailored according to however you like. The labs there, we've got a agreement through the Uni of Canberra, but they have about 10 or 11 labs based around Australia, all NADA accredited, that can be used. So you can do your swabs, using my mouth, you can use swabs around the hive, for example. You could use vacuum cleaners. You could use a whole range of different ways to collect particles and samples and be able to test it. And the whole idea is that we want to see whether there is organisms, and while I say eDNA, it's also eRNA, and eRNA is probably of more concern because that probably means it's items that have been recently shedded and that organism may be alive or may have been alive more recently, but picks up that sort of genetic material. Doesn't matter whether you're doing, we've done samples recently in ACT here in water, but you can do soil. You can swab, as I said, around the mouth of your hive or even on the top there. And that sort of genetic material can either be processed in bulk through your labs and partnerships that we've got them even over there in WA, or through standalone portable machines as well. So that is a bit about eDNA, and I think if you've got further questions, get in touch with us afterwards, but I might just go through noting the time, and I'm probably going to get in trouble for talking for too long. Here's a bit more about the pilot. So April Fools, we started 1st of April. We started in ACT and New South Wales, running them currently, and I think they're going through till early September. As I mentioned before, we're doing a bit of a citizen science approach. So in ACT, we don't have any commercial beekeepers, in case anyone wants to know. So it's a lot of hobbyists, a lot of people that were interested. We wrote out through an expression of interest and had a mammoth response. It was fantastic. In fact, probably more than what we could cater for. So we had to then go through and shortlist some local beekeepers there that we could use as part of this pilot. And then in terms of where we were going to go in New South Wales, we did pick Kempsey, as I said, that's as part of that emergency management zone. So I had to do a lot of work there. And also a series of, while we're also talking about the Vimana tech or the BeeRight, eDNA tests and confirming how they would go. So we ran it in parallel, and the idea was to test it against existing practices, a la sugar shakes, a la your alcohol washes and things like that. And the whole idea is that we work through and see whether we're happy with it. Here we go, a bit of an update. So we have done a number of early phases. And I say we, they're all we, but Mel and Jess and Uday and the team have been out there working there to take the samples. We did have some initial issues with putting the BeeRight technology in there. It didn't like the Canberra winter. You can see I'm already rugged up as well while I'm doing this, but had some issues, and we've been able to resolve that and got some new kits out there. But we've also done some of the initial eDNA swabs as well and run that back through. And because it's here in ACT, we went through Uni of Canberra. On the other side, the sheer scale of it, you can see there with New South Wales. So a lot of samples that were sent out. And, you know, a lot of this has already been funded for a very, very low amount, I will say, or payment in kind. And that's through DAF, SIRA, and all of the other partners that I did mention before. Next slide. So what did we find there? It was, Site 1 found that of the 150 commercial hives that we tested, 83% of them were infected with Varroa mite. And that was also compared against the results from alcohol washes and things like that. So I guess we knew that was going to be the case, but it's a matter of affirming and making sure that it's fit for purpose. But the BeeRight technology and the data collected within the first 48 hours was really exciting. It showed that we weren't able to just detect Varroa, but also showed that there's, you know, that opportunity, I guess, for remote infestation level monitoring and things like that. It was really, really good. Well, we found it. I shouldn't say it's that positive, but in terms of the time frame, it's really good, and we didn't expect it to work within such a short period of time. So that was good. I guess if it can be detected, you know, there is that opportunity. You did see the dashboards and things like that. You can get those alerts sort of pinging through, so you don't have to always be out checking and validating and doing your alcohol washes or the other ways, which do, I should say, kill a lot of bees anyway. So this reduces the need to actually do that. And, you know, what options you may want to take. We're up to site visit 2. No, just stay on site visit 2, sorry. So that was where I mentioned we just had some issues with the gateway device, but similar sort of volumes of products going out in terms of samples and kits. Next slide, thank you. So we have jumped through a fair bit, and in ACT it's gone really well. We've gone back out and recommenced installing the kits. ACT, we're continuing to send them out. So we're doing samples over that period that I mentioned, starting in April through to September, so that we're not just getting 1 month when there might be a lot of activity. We're also going through some of those colder months, which in ACT is right now, but through to September as we start to head into the spring, so that we get that sort of possible variance in hive activity and other things that the data can be correlated. And I will say, as part of this, you know, in terms of data protection and information, it's at the behest, and all of the people that were participating in it have that level of data privacy, data governance sort of protection mechanisms too. If they don't want to share it, they don't have to. It can be redacted. We can keep it in that sort of format so that things aren't known. But there's a lot of flexibility in how the data is obtained and how it's used. So, you know, I'm sure from a commercial aspect, there might be some that people don't want to share, and for good reason, but they can still have that information to process themselves. So probably something I should have mentioned before. Just moving on to the next slide. At the conclusion, so this is what we're going to have. We'll have all of those series or samples coming through from the BeeRight technology, from the eDNA. Also, we will have validated and worked through the traditional approaches, eDNA test and results, so it'll help us validate and verify. And again, all of this sort of stuff has been done in New Zealand, so it's good. It's a good working comparison. People say the Varroa mite behaves differently in Australia. It may do, but the technology and applications still work and detect it. And then we've got expert advice through CSIRO and others to help us prepare a final report for consideration, which will be made available to all and sundry if you're interested. After the pot, there we go, beating me to it. It's not the end as part of this sort of pilot. It's an opportunity for the CAB to help if people want, or, you know, as a result of this, you might say over in, for example, in WA, we want to consider and leverage off this and use it in, I don't know, Port of Esperance or around Fremantle, or I don't know, there might be other options that you may want to consider. And while we're talking about Varroa, it doesn't have to be that particular item. It can be used in other cases as well. The assays can be developed, and I probably should have mentioned that with the eDNA, according to whatever you business problem you're looking at, and validated through those NADA accredited standards with the lab. But whole idea is there'll be further opportunities. Obviously, we'll need to get the green light if we want to move away, and we have worked with the honeybee industry and council as well if they are considering moving against reducing alcohol washes, sugar shakes, and looking at the new technology. They want to be validated that they are up to the gold standard that is currently applied, and with it comes some benefits, as I said, less bees being killed, early warning detection and surveillance, data-driven sort of approach that can help inform and provide advice for people out there. So I think I did all right for time. Justin's probably going to tell me no, but any questions? There you go. You've got our innovation pilots. We're always open to any ideas. Have you considered, you know, this? Let us know, or if we could do it a different way. Also, all ears. We can't do this without partnerships, and it's all about that key bit of stronger partnerships to help keep the biosecurity system nice and strong. So hopefully that's sort of showing a little bit around how we're trying to make a difference in the Varroa pilot. And I might just stop there and hand back to Justin.
Yeah, look, thanks, Rich. That's fantastic. And really exciting and interesting piece of work, particularly with the timeliness by which you can get results in that sort of area, which is such a key part of all biosecurity surveillance and response capabilities is timeliness. So that's fantastic. Look, we'll go on to broad questions overall. I'll just cover off a couple that are in the chat. Ewan had asked Amy around whether there are any commercial beekeepers who use native pollinators instead of European honeybees.
Yes, there are. So for crops like macadamia and even some avocados, there are stingless bee keepers. So there's 8 different types of stingless bee in Australia, but normally the 2 species that are often used are Ostroplevia australis and Tetragonula carbonaria, and there are commercial beekeepers in both those areas, and the stingless bee industry is growing in terms of the awareness of stingless bees in crop pollination and their need within those systems. And we've certainly got some trials at the moment that are looking at floral resources and adding them into those cropping systems to help facilitate the pollination of the crop, but also the health of those stingless bee hives as well. Yeah.
That's great, thanks. And I just have to say that I'm after now knowing that blowflies pollinate mangoes, I'm questioning some of my life choices. So thank you for that. It's probably changed my own mind. Yolanda, and I'm going to mention Yolanda later, but I might just do it now. Yolanda from NRM South was actually the instigator of this topic today. So Yolanda, thank you very much for that, and really appreciate you instigating this. We'll cover off a little bit later on how others can do similarly within the NRM space. But Yolanda has highlighted that the Sustainable Agriculture Facilitators, which are a program delivered by the NRM sector with at least one facilitator in each NRM region, that they could have a really important role in terms of supporting that understanding and implementation of floral and nesting resources in ag systems. So it's really a question for Bianca and for Amy about, what are the resources that are out there already? What do we need more of? How do we access that? And how do we bring your sphere of work closer to what we're doing? So Amy and Bianca, if you could respond to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'll jump in just quickly. There are some resources out there that you guys could be equipped with to then roll out, but I think you're exactly right, Yolanda, it's about awareness. The Ween Bee Association have created these fantastic planting guides for different cropping regions, which are basically, they have the lens of the fact that they want native plants that are genetically provenant to that region. So that would be fantastic for supporting native pollinators, but it's also about supporting managed honeybees within those systems as well in terms of their health and their floral resource needs. So potentially, providing people with access to those resources, plus just raising awareness of what types of pollinators that they have on their farms and how they can support them. I think that would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, I also wanted to just add, wherever there is a good landscape in a farming enterprise that is a sustainable practice, all pollinators is a benefit to not only the crop and that producer, but also to the biodiversity in our ecosystems. I think at heart, all beekeepers that look to beekeeping for any reason is predominantly because they are environmentalists at heart, and that biodiversity underpins healthy honeybee colonies and healthy ecosystems. So I think wherever there is an opportunity to share the needs of both the commercial and recreational honeybee sector with the growing number of native pollination opportunities within the landscapes of food production, I think it's absolutely critical that there is some play between the two types of groups and all the parties that actually all benefit. And I think it underpins our pollination security But I also, there's lots of resources at Hort Innovations who are really keen contributors from different research and development programs in terms of best practice on farm for different purposes. So some of those might be with the way that they invest research and development into other native pollinators and also into the link between those really more grounded research for existing honeybee pollination dependent industries as well. So they really are a good key position to be able to give you a lot of resource there. And I don't know, look, I did look deeply into the NRM website and system to understand more about the overarching organisation. And I do think there is an opportunity to continue working together wherever needed to be able to represent the honeybee industry, but also to see that the future is really quite undetermined at the moment. We're in a bit of a kilter between the risks of relying on honeybees as much as we do, but at the same time, wherever we improve the pollination and the opportunities for other insects and other species that do pollination work, we're actually all benefiting. And I mean, I much prefer to see an underplanted orchard with flowers and things that support biodiversity than a foreign landscape that looks like the moon with a couple of trees. So, I mean, at that stage, I think we're all going to benefit from an input. And much of Amy's conversation and presentation really underpins some of those opportunities. But look, you can reach out to ARVIC anytime. We've got a resource subcommittee that focuses on floral access, predominantly on state and native forests, but there are also opportunities for other projects that are already going on around underplanting within crops to be able to support the honeybee industry as well as growers in terms of ag and horticulture.
Excellent. Thanks, Bianca. And you raise a really important point around the role of the NRM sector, but how it all sort of holistically integrates. We know that farmers find it much easier to be doing additional management of the natural resources when they're financially viable, when their back's not against the wall. So, you know, financially viable farmers are really important about holistic natural resource management, well beyond obviously managing pollinators and others, but that's obviously a key part of it too. So we certainly like to see that, and so anything that works in that favour, I think, is something that we're interested with as well. So we'll certainly provide the avenue to keep bringing us all together to share that information. We are running down really closely to the end of the hour, wherever you may be. So I did just want to cover off on the last couple of things. Anyone wants to pop in any other questions, I'm happy to entertain one right at the end, but I might just cover off on a few closing items in the meantime. As I mentioned earlier, the topic idea for today came from NRM Regions Australia's Biosecurity Community of Practice in discussions in there. So thank you very much again to Yolanda for suggesting that. For the NRMers that are online, we're really keen to hear about other topics and other areas you'd like webinars on, and our commitment to you is to gather really great presenters like we've had today to educate you and bring you up to speed on things that they're doing. So the Biosecurity Community of Practice is one of the components of NRM Regions Australia's National Biosecurity Hub, and that's been made available with some funding support from DAF's Chief Environmental Biosecurity Office. So we're really grateful for DAF's support with that. Thank you very much. We are planning to have a number of these webinars through the course of the year. Our next webinar topic, we have started to develop that, and sort of following on from Richard's presentation, it's very much looking at technical solutions that cross over between the agricultural and environmental biosecurity spaces, and really building off some of the work that Rich has profiled through the Catalysing Australia's Biosecurity initiatives, but also through other areas. So we're keen to understanding how everyone in the NRM space is increasingly being asked literally now to do more with less. We're really interested to explore where there are technological solutions that make things work either quicker, better, or more efficiently. So that will be in mid-September for those that want to join that. And for those non-NRM people that have joined us today, we're very happy for you to come along again, but also if this has been of value to you, really happy for you to explore that within your networks and liaise with Saj in terms of getting access to the next webinar for that. Our next Biosecurity Community of Practice meeting is in the 13th of August for the NRM people that are online. So please keep that in mind for those people that are on the Biosecurity COP. And lastly, just before we wrap up, I just wanted to mention that we are going to be having a soft launch of our new Biosecurity Knowledge Hub on the NRM Regions Australia website in early June. One of the things that we'll have as a feature in it is a portal to access information from other people's online repositories. And Bianca, I think we talked about pointing to your set of resources as well. So people will be able to go through there and click on a link and go to external resources to find all of those websites and fact sheets and other bits and pieces that they might want to, they might need to access, nested under either weeds, diseases, or pests. So keep an eye out for that. We'll have a soft launch of that in June. So I know that I've hit the end of my time. So look, thank you, everyone. Thank you to the presenters, to Bianca, Amy, and Rich for your presentations today. Saj and Trish, thank you for your support. And lastly, for all of the attendees, thank you very much for making your time available for our first webinar. We look forward to seeing you again at the next one. So thank you very much and have a great day.